"You're nothing," they whispered. But the Duke had yet to speak. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over the room, lingering on each noblewoman with a detached indifference. The ballroom buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with the scent of rosewater and lavender, the soft chime of crystal glasses mixing with the rustle of silk gowns. Lady Eleanor stood at the edge of the crowd, her plain dress and unkempt hair unnoticed by most. A servant's daughter, though born into nobility, she was as invisible as the air. Her heart sank as she watched the Duke, Victor Hawk, move gracefully through the room, his gaze as sharp as a blade, cutting through the sea of eager women vying for his attention. His footsteps were purposeful, each stride a declaration of power, a power that made her feel small, insignificant. The whispers followed her like a shadow, the words always the same. Not good enough. Never good enough. And yet, Eleanor remained in the corner, the last person anyone would expect to catch the Duke's eye. But then, time seemed to slow. The music softened, the conversations faded, and for a moment, the entire ballroom was suspended in silence. It was as if the world had shifted just for her. She caught his gaze, his intense, piercing gaze. The eyes of the Duke locked onto hers, and everything around her faded away. A shiver ran down her spine. He didn't look away. He didn't smile. He just stared, the weight of his attention holding her in place, as if she were the only person in the room. The floor felt colder beneath her feet. The whispers died, but the weight of their judgment remained. He moved, his steps deliberate, his presence like a storm brewing just out of reach. The air shifted with his approach. The women around her stiffened, eyes flicking nervously between the Duke and the quiet woman in the corner. Eleanor couldn't breathe. His hand reached out, unmistakable, unyielding. He grabbed her wrist. The room seemed to freeze. A heartbeat. The music stopped. The whispers ceased. All that remained was the feel of his fingers, firm and commanding, around her wrist. "You," the Duke said, his voice calm, yet carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "Come with me." He didn't wait for her response. He didn't need to. His grip tightened, guiding her forward, pulling her into the center of the room. Every step they took felt like an eternity. The eyes of the room followed them, filled with disbelief and envy. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. The floor felt as if it were miles away. The walls seemed to close in, and the murmurs began again, louder this time, more intense. How dare he choose her? She was no one. She had nothing. The Duke had made his choice, and for reasons she could not comprehend, she had been chosen. The ballroom seemed to tilt, as if the very foundations of her world had been shifted by the simple act of his hand upon her wrist. The crowd stood frozen, but Eleanor felt everything. The heat of the Duke's touch, the weight of his gaze, the electric charge that sparked between them, even if she couldn't understand it. "You're coming with me," he said again, his voice low, commanding, a promise. He guided her through the sea of shocked faces, the whispers growing louder with each step they took. The space around them felt smaller, the tension palpable, every eye on them as they passed. But Eleanor couldn't focus on them. She was focused on him, the Duke. He led her into a darkened corridor, away from the noise, away from the whispers. The moment they stepped beyond the ballroom's reach, he released her wrist, but she remained still, the air thick with tension. Silence. And then he spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness. "I don't care what they think. They don't matter. You matter." His words were soft, but they felt like thunder. The world outside the ballroom, outside their bubble, seemed to vanish. The only thing left was him, and the weight of the choice he had made. Eleanor's mind spun. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Duke smiled, a small, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Because you're the one they all overlooked. But I see you, Eleanor." Her name, uttered from his lips, sent a shock of warmth through her. It wasn't the warmth of comfort. No, it was something much stronger. Something that made her feel seen. And in that moment, Eleanor understood. She had been chosen. Not by chance. Not by fate. By Victor Hawk. And for reasons she still couldn't comprehend, she was no longer invisible. The world had just shifted, and it would never be the same again. The cold stone walls of the corridor seemed to close in around Eleanor as Duke Victor Hawk's footsteps echoed through the silence. His presence, always imposing, now felt like a weight she could not escape. She stood still, waiting for him to speak, yet the silence between them stretched on, thick with unspoken words. The Duke had released her wrist, but the tension lingered in the air like a charged spark, too dangerous to touch. His gaze never left her, his eyes sharp and calculating, as if measuring her every reaction. Eleanor felt the weight of his attention, the power he commanded without a word. "Why?" she whispered, the question escaping her before she could stop it. His lips barely moved when he answered. "Because you're different." His voice was low, measured, carrying an authority that made her feel both small and significant at the same time. She didn't understand. She couldn't. The world around her had always been one of rules, of expectations, where she was nothing more than a shadow in the background, never seen, never heard. But now she was standing here with him, the most powerful man in the room, in the most powerful position of all. "You think I'm invisible," he continued, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving hers. The space between them shrank with every word. Eleanor's heart raced as she felt the pull of him, his presence swallowing up everything around them. "But I don't see you that way." She swallowed, her throat dry. The words, those simple, dangerous words, struck her harder than she expected. How could he possibly see her when the world had taught her to hide? She had always been the one to fade into the background, to be overlooked, to be ignored. But now, here she was, standing at the center of his gaze, and she couldn't understand why. "I didn't ask for this," she said, more to herself than to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't need to," the Duke replied, his tone clipped but not unkind. "You were chosen." The finality in his voice made her skin prickle. He was not asking her opinion, not offering a choice. It wasn't about what she wanted. It was about what he had decided. And she felt herself caught in the current of his will, unable to break free. The Duke turned on his heel, his cape flowing behind him like a dark shadow. Eleanor's breath hitched as she followed him, her legs unsteady beneath her, as though the world had shifted beneath her feet. "Come," he said, his voice commanding, a tone that left no room for argument. "We're not done here." She moved without thinking, her steps echoing on the cold marble floor as they walked down the narrow corridor. Every step felt like a betrayal of her old life, of the life she had known where she was safe in her obscurity. But now, with the Duke leading her into unknown territory, she was no longer invisible. She was a choice, and that realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. They reached a small, dimly lit room at the end of the hall, and the Duke turned to face her. His eyes softened for a brief moment, but only a brief moment. "Stay," he said, his voice firm, though not unkind. Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was to him or to herself. She stayed in the center of the room, watching as he moved with fluid grace, his presence commanding the space. Every inch of him exuded power, and she felt small in comparison, her own body still trembling from the weight of his words, his touch. He stopped in front of her, his gaze unwavering. "You're not just any woman," he said, his voice low. "You're the one I've chosen. That means something." Eleanor didn't know what it meant yet, but she felt it. The pull, the power, and she couldn't deny it. His eyes searched hers, probing, as if looking for something she wasn't sure she could give. "You're not like the others," he said, his voice softening. "You don't belong in the background." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor felt the weight of being seen. Not just looked at, not just acknowledged, but truly seen. She didn't know how to respond. She didn't know if she could. Everything she had been taught, everything she had been raised to believe, was being turned on its head. But in that moment, standing before him, she knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same. The Duke had chosen her, and there was no going back. The air in the small room was thick with tension as Duke Victor Hawk stood before Eleanor, his presence towering over her like a storm on the horizon. She could feel the heat of his gaze, unwavering, as it raked over her, reading her every reaction. His silence spoke volumes, the weight of it pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Eleanor tried to stand tall, but the pull of his power was undeniable, and for the first time in her life, she felt small, exposed. She shifted uneasily, her hands clasped in front of her, unable to break the stillness that surrounded them. "You're not the woman you were when you entered that ballroom," the Duke finally said, his voice a low, quiet command. And neither am I. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. What did he mean? She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she watched as he moved across the room with deliberate precision, every step measured and controlled. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in his movements. He exuded power, a quiet authority that seemed to fill the space around them. I'm not sure I understand, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible, her eyes never leaving him. You don't have to understand, the Duke replied, his tone sharper now, a glimmer of something colder in his eyes. You only need to accept. His words were like a command, a truth she had no choice but to face. She swallowed hard, her chest tightening with the weight of his gaze. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, his movements calculated and deliberate. The space that had once felt like a safe distance now felt suffocating, as though the air was thickening around her with every inch he drew nearer. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, the sheer force of his presence so close to her. Eleanor's breath hitched, and she involuntarily took a small step back. But the Duke was faster. Before she could react, his hand shot out, gripping her arm with a firm, almost possessive touch. The sudden contact made her gasp, her pulse racing in her veins. His fingers were like iron, not tight enough to hurt, but strong enough to remind her of his power, of his complete control. You'll learn, he said, his voice steady, yet his words carried an edge that sent a shiver down her spine. That I choose who I want, and you, he paused, his gaze softening for a split second. You've been chosen. The words hung in the air like a weight she couldn't lift. She tried to speak, to protest, but her voice faltered. His grip on her arm tightened slightly, and the slight increase in pressure silenced her. There's no need for questions, he continued, stepping even closer, forcing her to look up at him. Only obedience. His voice was calm, yet there was an undeniable force behind it, a command that she couldn't ignore even if she wanted to. The room felt smaller with every second that passed. The space between them was shrinking, the distance she had once kept now gone, replaced with the looming presence of a man who could make her world shift with a single word. Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she fought to remain still, to keep her composure. She had never felt this way before, so completely out of control. And yet, as much as she wanted to resist, a part of her, the part that had been invisible for so long, welcomed the attention. She felt herself drawn to him, her heart pounding as his gaze softened, just slightly. Do you understand? He asked, his voice now almost gentle, though there was no mistaking the power still lingering in his words. Eleanor nodded, too stunned to speak, the words caught in her throat. He seemed to sense her hesitation, his lips curving into the faintest of smiles. Good, he murmured, releasing her arm and taking a step back. Then we begin. The room was silent, save for the soft rustle of fabric as Eleanor exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and yet there was a strange thrill running through her veins, a rush of adrenaline that made her pulse race. The Duke had chosen her. She had never been anyone's choice before, and now she was his. The realization hit her with a force she hadn't expected, and as the Duke turned to leave, she couldn't stop herself from following him, drawn by something she couldn't name. She had been invisible for so long, but now, in his presence, she was seen, and that scared her more than anything else. The room buzzed with whispers as Eleanor entered the grand dining hall, the hum of noble conversation faltering the moment she stepped through the door. She had been at the Duke's side all evening, but tonight, things felt different. His hand had been a constant presence at her back, guiding her, commanding her. She had never been so acutely aware of the weight of his attention. The Duke's presence, always powerful, was now something she could feel pressing against her chest, against the air itself. But tonight, she was no longer invisible. The heavy murmurs of judgment filled the space around her, and despite her best efforts, Eleanor couldn't help but feel every gaze turned toward her. Her heart pounded, and she glanced at the Duke beside her. His gaze was steady, unwavering, as if he could sense the shift, as if he welcomed it. Do you see them? He asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Eleanor's throat tightened. The room was silent now, the grand chandeliers casting their soft light over the table of high-ranking nobles. Their eyes were filled with barely concealed disdain as they observed her, standing beside the Duke. Unworthy, unnoticed, until now. The silence stretched between them, thick with judgment. Eleanor could feel their eyes dissecting her every move, scrutinizing every inch of her. "They never thought you would belong here," Victor continued, his words like a cold breeze sweeping over her skin. "But now you do." His words struck her harder than she expected. The Duke's hand remained at her back, but it no longer felt comforting. It felt like a shield, and the pressure of it was palpable. The nobles watched in stunned silence, their disbelief so thick she could almost taste it. The Duke didn't care. He didn't care that they were all watching, judging, whispering. His confidence filled the room, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor felt the power of someone else's. Conviction wrapped around her like a cloak. She stood taller, though her heart raced in her chest, as the Duke shifted beside her, his hand finally resting lightly at the small of her back. The room seemed to shrink, the distance between them and the others stretching thinner with each passing moment. The Duke stood at the head of the table, and the nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their whispers had become louder, sharper, as if each syllable aimed to cut through the growing tension. She could hear them now. "She's nothing but a servant's daughter. She doesn't belong here. A match like this will ruin the Duke's reputation." And still, the Duke said nothing. He did not need to. His silence was louder than any of their words. He turned to her, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a chill through her spine. "Let them talk," he whispered, his lips brushing her ear. "None of it matters." But Eleanor's breath hitched, her heart pounding as she felt every gaze that followed them. She felt the weight of their judgment as though it had physically pressed itself against her chest, her mind struggling to stay calm as she fought to keep her composure. She was no longer invisible. She was a target. The Duke's hand remained firm, a constant pressure on her back, guiding her as he led her through the room. With every step they took, the tension escalated. The nobles' eyes followed them, their stares filled with disbelief, their whispers louder, more pronounced. They could no longer deny her presence. Eleanor could hear the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere as she and the Duke moved toward the center of the hall. Their voices began to rise, growing frantic, though their words were indistinguishable. Eleanor's mind swirled. She couldn't understand it. How could she, a woman deemed unworthy by society, stand beside the Duke like this? But she wasn't questioning it anymore. She was starting to understand something else. The Duke had made his decision, and for better or worse, she was part of it. The tension in the room was unbearable, and for the first time, Eleanor felt the full weight of what it meant to stand beside a man like Victor Hawk. He was a man of immense power, and she had been chosen. Chosen by him. "Do you feel it?" he asked quietly, his hand never leaving her back. Eleanor swallowed hard, her breath shallow. She felt everything, the heat of his touch, the weight of the noble's stares, the electric charge that seemed to crackle in the air between them. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and there was no going back. She was no longer the invisible woman she had once been. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The Duke, ever composed, stood like a pillar of authority, his mere presence enough to command the room. And then, as though to seal the final moment, the Duke stepped forward, pushing through the crowd of nobles who had once dismissed Eleanor without a second glance. His voice rang out, sharp, precise, and unyielding. "I have made my choice," he declared, his eyes sweeping across the room, daring anyone to challenge him. "And she will stand by my side." The room went quiet. The words hung in the air, a declaration that left no room for doubt, no space for protest. Eleanor's heart raced in her chest, and though she felt the sting of the noble's stares, she stood firm. She had been chosen, and the power of that choice surged through her like a tide, lifting her higher than she ever thought possible. The ballroom had transformed. What had once been a place of elegance and quiet whispers now felt suffocating, as if every eye was fixed on Eleanor. She stood beside Duke Victor Hawk, the weight of his hand on her back steady and reassuring, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside her. She could feel the eyes of the room upon them, the judgment, the whispers, sharp as daggers. The tension was palpable, thickening with every breath. She was no longer invisible, no longer the quiet daughter of a disgraced family. She was standing here, beside the Duke, and that was enough to unravel everything. The nobles around them exchanged glances, their whispers cutting through the air. She doesn't belong here. How could he choose her? The words stung, but Eleanor stood taller. She had no choice now but to remain at his side. The Duke didn't seem to notice the growing discomfort. His attention remained focused on the room, his presence commanding the space with an ease that made her feel both insignificant and essential. His grip on her waist tightened slightly, as if reminding her that she was no longer just a shadow in the background. She was his. Let them talk, Victor murmured, his voice calm, yet carrying an unmistakable authority. None of it matters. But it did matter. It mattered more than she could have ever imagined. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, yet so powerful all at once. The room seemed to shrink as the voices around them grew louder, more frantic. And still, the Duke did not falter. They'll never accept you, Victor continued, his eyes scanning the room as if daring anyone to challenge him. But they don't need to. You only need to accept who you are now. His words were both a comfort and a challenge, and Eleanor felt them sink deep into her bones. She was no longer the woman they had ignored. She was the woman he had chosen. And that changed everything. As they moved through the crowd, the air seemed to grow heavier. The space around them pulsed with tension. Every eye was on them, every whisper sharper, more pronounced. Eleanor could feel their eyes following her every move, could hear their thoughts behind their cold stares. She was an outsider, a woman who did not belong in this world of power, of nobility, and yet here she was, walking beside the Duke as if she were the most important person in the room. Victor's presence was undeniable, and with each step, he made it clear that he was in control. The nobles parted before them, their gazes flickering between the Duke and the woman at his side. The power dynamic had shifted, and Eleanor could feel it in every bone of her body. She had been chosen, and nothing, not even the whispered judgments of the room, could change that. As they reached the center of the ballroom, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The Duke stopped, his hand still firm on her back, and turned to face the gathering crowd. The silence in the room was deafening. All eyes were on him, on them. He was untouchable, a man of power and authority who had never had to answer to anyone. But now, in this moment, he had made a choice. A choice that no one in this room, no one in this world, could undo. I choose her, Victor said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. And she will stand by me. His words were a declaration, a challenge to anyone who thought they could change his mind. And in that moment, Eleanor realized the true weight of his decision. She wasn't just standing beside him because of his power. She was standing beside him because he had chosen her. The room exploded with murmurs, the tension breaking like a thunderclap in the distance. Eleanor felt the shock waves of the crowd's disbelief wash over her, but she held her ground. The Duke's hand remained on her back, and she could feel the quiet strength in his touch, the steadying presence of the man who had made her a part of his world. You'll learn to silence them, Victor said quietly, his words just for her. They'll never understand. But that doesn't matter. Eleanor didn't speak. She didn't need to. The weight of his words, of his choice, was enough. The room was still reeling from the Duke's declaration, but Eleanor had found something in that moment, something she had never expected. Power. Not just the power of the Duke, but her own power. She was no longer the woman they had cast aside. She was the one the Duke had chosen, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen, and she would never be the same. The room was thick with unspoken tension, the air crackling like a storm on the edge of breaking. Eleanor stood beside Duke Victor Hawk, her heart pounding in her chest, though she tried to appear composed. The ballroom, once filled with the sound of lively conversation, had gone silent, save for the soft rustling of fabric and the occasional clink of glass. Every eye in the room was on them, on her. The whispers had not ceased, but now they were louder, sharper, more venomous. She doesn't belong here. Who does he think she is? The words were like daggers, each one digging deeper, but Eleanor stood still, her gaze fixed ahead. She had no choice but to endure. The Duke's hand was still, firm at her back, but his presence beside her was now something different. It was a shield, but also a constant reminder of the power dynamic that had shifted between them. She had been chosen, and the consequences of that choice were becoming more real with each passing moment. "Ignore them," Victor whispered, his voice low, but the command in it was unmistakable. His eyes never left the crowd, his posture unwavering. "They'll learn their place soon enough." Eleanor could feel his confidence, his complete disregard for the opinions of those around them. He wasn't just ignoring the whispers, he was daring them to challenge him. And Eleanor? She was standing by his side, a part of the spectacle, but she was more than that now. She was a symbol, and the weight of that symbol pressed heavily on her chest. The moment lingered between them, and Eleanor could feel the power in the room shift, a subtle but undeniable change. The nobles were no longer just watching, they were waiting. Waiting for the Duke to act, waiting for Eleanor to falter, to reveal herself as unworthy. But she didn't. She wouldn't. The pressure of their stares was unbearable, but she refused to break. Victor, however, seemed to thrive in it. He moved, his presence commanding the space around them, and Eleanor followed in his wake, the space between them closing with each step they took. His fingers grazed the small of her back, a subtle but firm touch, and the world seemed to slow. The whispers, the judgment, it all seemed to fade into the background as they walked through the room. She wasn't sure what she expected from him, but it certainly wasn't this. The silent strength, the way he made it clear that nothing and no one could sway him from his choices. And yet, as they made their way through the crowd, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The way the room had quieted, the way the nobles looked at them now, it wasn't admiration. It was something darker, something she couldn't name. As they reached the center of the ballroom, the crowd parted in front of them like a river splitting for a ship. The Duke's every step echoed with authority, his posture straight and unyielding. He didn't glance at anyone. He didn't need to. The world bent to his will. Eleanor's heart beat in her throat. She was standing on the precipice now, and she knew, in this moment, that there was no going back. "This is your world now," Victor said, his voice so low she could barely hear him, but the weight of his words settled heavily in her chest. He was right. Her life, her position, everything had changed in the span of an hour. She was no longer the overlooked noblewoman, the invisible woman in the shadows. She was with him, and as much as she wanted to question it, as much as she wanted to resist, part of her knew that she couldn't. "I'll show them who you are," he continued, his eyes scanning the room as he spoke. "I'll show them all." The words hung in the air between them, but Eleanor didn't respond. She couldn't. The room was filled with uncertainty, the tension so thick it almost felt like a physical presence. She could feel the weight of the nobles' stares on her, but none of them dared to speak. Not yet. The Duke's declaration had shifted the balance, but they were all waiting for him to make his move, for him to solidify his claim. Eleanor's throat was dry. She could feel her body trembling slightly, but she forced herself to stand tall. She would not let them see her falter. "Stay by me," Victor said, his voice steady. "Let them see what happens when they doubt me." And then, as though the world held its breath, he reached out and gently placed his hand on her arm, guiding her forward. The crowd parted again, but this time, there was something different in the way they looked at her. It wasn't just disdain anymore. There was something else there. Fear. And with that fear came respect, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Eleanor could feel it now. She wasn't just the Duke's companion. She was a force in her own right. And as she walked beside him, her heart still racing in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently. She had been chosen, and nothing would ever be the same again. The room pulsed with the kind of tension that could snap at any moment, the silence between them deafening. Duke Victor Hawk stood tall, his hand still resting on Eleanor's back as they entered the heart of the gathering. The whispers grew louder now, sharper, more biting than before. "What is she doing here? She's not fit for him. It's scandalous." The words came at them from every direction, but the Duke remained unflinching. Eleanor, however, could feel every word, each one like a lash against her skin. She could feel her body tightening, her heart racing, but there was no escape. She was tethered to him now, and whatever they said, whatever they thought, she had no choice but to endure. Her breath hitched as they moved through the room, the weight of the eyes upon them growing heavier with each step. It was suffocating, this constant scrutiny, the feeling of being both seen and condemned. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear, but the Duke's hand was firm, guiding her forward. His touch was a command, steadying her, pulling her through the storm of judgment. She had never been so aware of herself, of her every movement, of the space she occupied. She was exposed, but the Duke didn't care. He was leading her, and it was clear now that he would not let her slip into the shadows again. They reached the center of the room, and the world seemed to stop. The guests fell silent, all eyes on them, the whispers dying down as the Duke turned to face them. Eleanor felt the weight of it, the weight of their stares, but she couldn't look away from him. His eyes were sharp, his face unreadable, yet there was something in the way he held her that made her feel as if she had been lifted, as though he had made her someone to be reckoned with. "You've chosen her?" A voice broke through the silence, a challenge laced with disbelief. It was Lord Pennington, an older nobleman known for his influence and his sharp tongue. The room seemed to hold its breath as all eyes turned to him. Victor didn't flinch. His gaze never left the crowd. "I've chosen her," he said, his voice calm, but the force behind it was unmistakable. Eleanor could feel his words like a shield, wrapping around her, protecting her from the doubt in the room. She didn't know how to respond. How could she, when she felt so out of place, so unworthy of the Duke's declaration? But she knew one thing. She would not be weak. She would not let them see her break. Her hands clenched at her sides, the tension in her chest making it hard to breathe. She forced herself to stand tall, her chin lifting slightly, meeting Victor's gaze. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, but it wasn't just the tension of the room. It was the realization that she was in this moment, a part of it, whether she understood it or not. "This is madness," Lady Vance's voice rang out, cutting through the stillness. Eleanor glanced at her, seeing the contempt in the older woman's eyes. The others were beginning to murmur again, their voices rising as they spoke among themselves. But the Duke didn't even acknowledge them. His attention was solely on Eleanor. His eyes softened for just a moment, and in that fleeting instant, she felt something stir inside her, something she couldn't name, something that both terrified and empowered her. He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. She felt his presence like a force, strong and unwavering. His hand reached out, brushing against her arm, a gentle touch that was anything but. It was a mark, a claim, a reminder that she no longer had a choice in this. She had been chosen, and nothing could take that away. The crowd seemed to fade away as he leaned in slightly, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't let them break you," he whispered. Eleanor's heart beat faster in her chest, and for a moment, the world felt distant, like a dream. He pulled back just as quickly, his focus returning to the room. "You will stand beside me," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The finality of his words left no room for argument, and the room fell silent again, the weight of his declaration settling over them. Eleanor's hands trembled at her sides, but she forced herself to remain still, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. She was no longer just an observer. She was part of this. She was his. The room was still, the tension palpable. The other nobles exchanged looks, their disbelief clear, but no one dared to challenge the Duke's command. And in that moment, Eleanor realized something. She wasn't just standing beside him as a symbol of his choice. She was standing there because she had been chosen to be part of this world, a world that had once seemed so far out of reach. She wasn't invisible anymore. And that realization, that truth, made her heart race faster, the rush of emotions almost overwhelming. The Duke turned, leading her once again through the sea of nobles who had once looked at her with disdain. But now, there was something else in their eyes, a flicker of fear, of uncertainty. They had seen it now. She had been chosen, and nothing would ever be the same. The room felt smaller with each passing moment, the weight of every eye pressing against Eleanor as she walked alongside Duke Victor Hawk. The once grandiose whispers of disbelief had shifted to an almost tangible force, an oppressive hum that filled the air. The nobles watched with a mixture of disdain and curiosity, unable to understand the Duke's choice, but too fearful to question it aloud. Eleanor could feel their gaze like the sting of 1,000 unseen needles, each one testing her resolve. The Duke, however, was unfazed. His presence was a constant, solid and unmoving, a pillar of control in a sea of uncertainty. His hand was firm at her back, guiding her through the crowd, but it was not just a gesture of support. It was a a constant reminder of her place beside him, of the choice that had been made. She was no longer invisible. She was a part of this world, and the world was watching. "Stay with me." Victor's voice was low, almost a whisper, but the command in it was clear. Eleanor nodded slightly, though the movement was almost imperceptible, a reflex rather than a conscious decision. The power dynamic between them had shifted again. The world had seen her, and now she was part of it. An undeniable presence, both a source of power and a symbol of defiance. But Eleanor felt a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The judgment didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. The higher the stakes, the more they seemed to push against her. They had always told her she was nothing, but now they couldn't seem to look away. The whispers swirled, louder and more cutting. "A disgrace," someone muttered. "A scandal." But the Duke didn't react. He didn't even acknowledge the words. Instead, his focus remained entirely on the crowd, his eyes scanning the room with the precision of a man who had long since stopped caring about the opinions of others. And yet, Eleanor felt every glance, every murmur, as if they were directed solely at her. The tension was suffocating, the air thick with unresolved conflict. She could feel it in her chest, the way her heart raced against the pressure building inside her. How could she stand here, in this moment, when everything inside her screamed to run? But she didn't. She couldn't. "I'm not afraid of them," Victor said, his voice low, but the force behind it made her stiffen. "And neither should you be." She turned her head toward him, meeting his gaze for the first time since they had entered the room. His eyes were cold, unwavering, but there was something in them, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even concern. It was something more calculated. "You belong here," he continued, his voice firm as if he were trying to convince not just her, but himself. Eleanor swallowed, the words sticking in her throat. The idea of belonging in this world felt foreign, like something that didn't belong to her. She had never been taught to belong here. But standing next to Victor, in the midst of this whirlwind, she felt something shift. She was no longer an outsider. She was with him. And with that realization came another, more terrifying truth. She would never be the same. The room seemed to pulse with anticipation, the silence stretching longer as they made their way deeper into the heart of the gathering. As they moved, the crowd parted before them, but not out of respect. It was fear. Fear of the Duke. Fear of the unknown. Eleanor could feel it, the way the air grew heavier, the way the noble's eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. They had underestimated her. They had underestimated him. But it wasn't just the Duke they were afraid of. It was the power he held over her. The power they could never understand. As they reached the center of the ballroom, the weight of the moment hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She was standing at the center of it all, with Victor Hawk beside her, a man who held the room in the palm of his hand. He was the power, the force that moved everything around him, and she was a part of it now. "Let them watch," he murmured, his voice barely a breath against her ear. "Let them see what happens when they challenge me." His words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. The tension between them was palpable, the feeling of it rising with every step, every passing second. Eleanor's mind raced, her chest tight with the strain of keeping her composure. She wasn't sure what to make of it, of him, of the world that had shifted so suddenly around her. But one thing was clear, she was no longer just a spectator. She was in this. She was a part of it. She was part of his world. And that made her both stronger and more vulnerable than she had ever been before. The room watched in stunned silence, the nobles too caught in their own confusion and fear to speak. The Duke had made his move. He had chosen her. And now, nothing could change that. Nothing could take away the power of that choice. Eleanor could feel her heart race in her chest, the pressure building, the tension of the moment so thick she could barely breathe. But through it all, one thought echoed in her mind. She had been seen. She had been chosen. And now, she would never be invisible again. The tension in the ballroom was so thick it seemed to hang in the air, suffocating everyone in its wake. Eleanor could feel it wrapping around her like a heavy cloak as she stood beside Duke Victor Hawk, his presence unshakable. Yet somehow, the room felt even smaller than it had moments ago. The whispers had turned into muttered words of disbelief, and she could feel the eyes on her, sharp and cutting. They watched her every move, waiting for her to falter. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. The weight of their judgment had never been so palpable. As they moved through the sea of nobility, the room seemed to close in around them, the space between them and the crowd growing smaller with each passing step. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, her breath shallow as she clung to the strength of the Duke beside her. He was a fortress, unyielding and strong, but even his presence couldn't completely shield her from the oppressive air of judgment. The nobles stared at her as though she were an intruder, as though she didn't belong in the very space she now occupied by his side. And still, the Duke didn't flinch. He didn't react. His eyes were locked on the crowd, his posture commanding the room with the simple authority that only a man like him could possess. But Eleanor could feel his touch, firm at her back, guiding her, grounding her. The space around them seemed to crackle with the electricity of unspoken words. The crowd parted for them, but not out of respect. It was fear. Fear of him. Fear of her. The shift in power was palpable, and Eleanor felt it pressing in on her chest. She was no longer the invisible woman, the one everyone had dismissed and overlooked. No, she was standing here, in the center of it all, beside the Duke who had chosen her, who had made her a part of this world. But it wasn't just her presence that had changed. It was the power she now held, whether she realized it or not. "You're mine." The Duke's voice cut through the heavy silence, his words low but sharp. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. His words weren't a question. They weren't an invitation. They were a statement, one that left no room for doubt, no room for argument. He had claimed her, and the room had no choice but to accept it. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words, feeling them sink deep into her chest. "You will stand by me," he continued, his voice unwavering. "And they will learn to accept that." The room was still, the air thick with tension as the nobles exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. The Duke's declaration had shattered the fragile facade of civility. They were no longer just observers. They were witnesses to a shift in power that none of them could have predicted. Eleanor's pulse raced as the full impact of the moment settled over her. She wasn't just standing beside him anymore. She wasn't just a silent partner in this grand performance. She was part of the drama, part of the story that was unfolding before them all. The power had shifted, and now there was no turning back. "You will stay by me," the Duke said again, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving hers. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she felt his grip tighten on her arm, pulling her closer. The touch was firm, yet there was an unmistakable sense of ownership in it. She was his, and everyone in the room could see it. The nobles were no longer looking at her with disdain. They were looking at her with something else. Fear. The fear of the unknown. The fear of the power she now represented. The fear of what the Duke had done. The shift in the air was undeniable. It was as if the room itself had drawn a collective breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. And then, just as suddenly, the Duke released her arm, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This is no longer your world," he said, his voice clear, his words cutting through the thick tension. "This is ours." The finality of his statement hung in the air, reverberating through the space around them. The room held its breath, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a shroud. Eleanor could feel it now. The power, the shift, the overwhelming sense that this was only the beginning. She was no longer just the woman the world had dismissed. She was the woman the Duke had chosen, and she could feel that power surging through her, building inside her chest. The world had watched as he claimed her. But now, the world would watch as she claimed her place beside him. The crowd was silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood firm, her gaze steady. She wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't going to fade into the background again. She was his, and she would make sure everyone knew it. The Duke's hand rested on her back once again, a silent affirmation of his power, his claim. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor understood what it meant to be seen. Not as an outsider, not as someone who had to fight for a place, but as someone who belonged. The room was still, but Eleanor could feel it, the power that now resided in her. The world had been turned upside down, and she was standing at the center of it, unshaken, unyielding. And she wasn't going anywhere. The Duke's grip on Eleanor's arm tightened as they moved through the grand hall, the weight of his touch a constant reminder of his power. The room, filled with murmurs and stares, seemed to shrink as he guided her forward. She could feel the tension mounting, the pressure building in her chest, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The whispers that had once been a constant in the background were now deafening, louder than ever, but the Duke remained unshaken. His presence was undeniable, his authority so clear it seemed to hang in the air. "They'll never accept you." A voice from the crowd hissed, sharp and cutting, "Not in this world." The words struck Eleanor like a blow, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't. She had been here before, in a world where she was invisible, where she had no place. But that was no longer her reality. She was with him now. She was seen. The Duke's hand never left her back, guiding her as they moved toward the center of the room. The tension was thick, the air heavy with unspoken challenges and accusations. But still, Victor moved forward, unwavering, his eyes scanning the crowd. He didn't care about their whispers. He didn't care about their judgment. All that mattered was that she stood beside him. And that was enough. "She's nothing," someone said, their voice tinged with bitterness. But the Duke did not even acknowledge the comment. His gaze remained fixed ahead, his posture unyielding. Eleanor could feel the shift in the room, the way the nobles were beginning to realize something they hadn't before. This was no longer a matter of choice. This was a matter of power, and the Duke had claimed it. She had been chosen. The weight of that realization hit her like a wave, a rush of emotion flooding her chest. She had never felt more alive, more important. And yet, in that moment, she felt something else, fear. Not of the Duke, but of what would come next. What had she truly agreed to by standing beside him? "Victor," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely audible over the rising hum of the crowd. He turned to her, his eyes softening just for a moment before he spoke. "You belong here," he said, his voice low, a quiet command. "With me." The certainty in his words settled over her, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she believed it. But the doubts, the fears, lingered. Was she truly part of this world now? Or was she just another pawn in a game she didn't understand? The room seemed to pulse with the growing tension, the nobles shifting uneasily, exchanging glances as if waiting for something to give, for the storm to break. Eleanor's heart raced, her thoughts spinning. She had been chosen, but what did that truly mean? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for certain. She would not be the weak woman she had once been. She had power now. She had been given a place in this world, and she would fight for it. The crowd parted as they reached the center, the eyes of the room fixed on them, watching, waiting. And then, just as the silence seemed unbearable, the Duke stepped forward. His voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a knife. "You think she doesn't belong," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "You think I've made a mistake. But you're wrong. She's more than any of you will ever understand." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Eleanor could feel the power in them, the way the room seemed to bend to his will. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the world itself had stopped, waiting for the next move. Then, suddenly, everything shifted. Eleanor felt it in her bones, the moment when the power dynamics in the room tipped. It was a shift so subtle, so quick, that no one could have predicted it. The nobles, who had once looked at her with contempt, now watched her with something else, something different. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was respect. She was no longer the invisible woman in the background. She was the woman the Duke had chosen. And that, in itself, made her powerful. The realization hit her like a wave, a rush of clarity flooding her senses. She wasn't just a pawn in his game. She was a force in her own right. And the Duke's words, his declaration, had shifted everything. She could feel the change in the room, the way the nobles now looked at her with new eyes. They were still uncertain, still unsure of her place in this world, but there was a shift. She could see it in their eyes. She was no longer just the woman they whispered about. She was the woman they feared, the woman they would have to reckon with. The Duke's hand remained steady on her back, guiding her forward, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor didn't feel like she was trailing behind. She was walking beside him, equal, undeniable. "You're mine," Victor said again, his voice barely more than a whisper, but there was a force in his words that made her heart race. "And you will always be mine." The certainty in his tone left no room for argument, and as she met his gaze, she understood. She had been chosen, and now, nothing could take that away. The power had shifted, and she was no longer the woman they had once dismissed. She was the woman the Duke had chosen, and she would make sure they all knew it. The weight of the moment hung in the air like an unspoken promise, each breath in the room seeming to draw the tension tighter. Eleanor could feel it, could feel the pressure of every gaze on her, the eyes of the noblemen and women around her, watching, waiting. She stood beside Victor, but for the first time since this whirlwind began, she felt like an outsider. A wave of uncertainty crashed through her, despite the firm presence of the Duke by her side. He had made her his, and yet, the truth she had been ignoring began to come into sharp focus. The shift in power was undeniable, the world around them spinning faster with every move they made. She could feel the gravity of the change, the way the room seemed to shrink around them. The words of the nobles, once hushed whispers, now became more direct, more venomous. She doesn't deserve him. She's a mere pawn, not a match for him. What is this? A disgrace? Their voices rose in unison, their judgment palpable, but still, the Duke did not flinch. He stood tall, as immovable as a mountain, his hand steady at her back, guiding her through the storm of voices and stares. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears as the weight of the situation bore down on her. She wanted to shrink away, to escape from the scrutiny, but she couldn't. The Duke's presence held her in place, his touch both a comfort and a reminder of what had been chosen for her. But there was something else now, something shifting within her. She wasn't just a passive participant in this power play anymore. The realization slammed into her with the force of a tidal wave. She had been chosen, yes, but not just for his sake. She had been chosen for herself. The Duke's power, his unshakable presence, had opened a door for her, but it was up to her to walk through it. The tension in the air thickened, almost unbearable, as the noblemen and women stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. She could feel their eyes slicing through her, the weight of their judgment, so heavy she thought she might collapse under it. But she didn't. She stood tall, lifting her chin slightly, meeting their eyes with a newfound strength she had never felt before. She was no longer the woman they had ignored. She was no longer the woman they thought was beneath them. She was someone who had been chosen to stand beside the Duke, and that fact alone held power. Do you think they'll stop whispering? Victor's voice was soft, but the edge in it was unmistakable. He leaned in closer, his words just for her. They'll never stop, but it's their weakness, not yours. His words seemed to settle over her, a strange comfort in their simplicity. He didn't need to explain further. She understood. The nobles might never stop looking down on her, never stop whispering behind their hands, but that wasn't her problem anymore. The power had shifted. She was part of this world now, and there was no going back. As the Duke stepped forward, his posture commanding and unyielding, Eleanor felt something stir within her, a deep, burning need to prove herself. She wasn't just his companion. She wasn't just the woman everyone had expected to fade into the background. She was his equal. She would show them that. She would show them all. She belongs. Here, the Duke's voice rang out, louder than any of the murmurs. His declaration sliced through the air like a blade, quieting the room. The nobles shifted uneasily, their stares sharp, but none dared to challenge him. Eleanor felt her heart race as the room held its breath. They had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the Duke's choice was solidified, when it became undeniable that Eleanor was more than just a silent figure at his side. She was a force in her own right. Do you understand? Victor's words were low but filled with the weight of everything that had been said, everything that had been chosen. Eleanor turned to him, their eyes meeting. She could see the resolve in his gaze, the certainty that this was the way it was meant to be. He had chosen her. And in that moment, she realized something that shook her to her core. She had chosen him, too. She nodded slightly, the action small, but filled with meaning. She was ready. She was ready to claim her place beside him, ready to face the world that had looked down on her for so long. The power that had once been out of her reach was now hers to command. She had been chosen, and nothing, not their judgment, not their whispers, could take that from her. The Duke stepped forward, pulling her along with him as he made his way through the crowd. Every eye was on them, but this time, the gaze of the room held something different. Fear, respect. The nobles were no longer looking at her with disdain. They were looking at her with a recognition that hadn't been there before. She had been seen, and the power shift that had begun with the Duke's choice had rippled through the entire room. And as they moved toward the door, the finality of the moment settled over Eleanor like a weight she couldn't escape. She wasn't just the Duke's chosen woman. She was someone who had a place in this world, and no one, not even the people who once thought her beneath them, could take that away. The ballroom was silent now, the weight of what had just occurred settling over the crowd like a heavy fog. The Duke and Eleanor stood at the center, their presence undeniable, their connection unshakable. The eyes of the room, once filled with judgment and whispers, now seemed to hold something else, something more complex. Fear. Respect. The power shift was complete. There was no going back now. The tension, thick as ever, hung in the air, but there was a stillness to it now, a finality that felt both suffocating and liberating. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of the monumental change she had just undergone. She wasn't the invisible woman anymore. She wasn't the one who faded into the background. She was here, standing beside the Duke, and she had a place in this world now. But even as the power dynamic shifted in her favor, she could still feel the echoes of the judgment in the room. It hadn't gone away, not completely. It was still there, lingering, hanging in the air like a shadow. She could feel the weight of their eyes, still on her. But this time, it was different. They weren't looking down on her. They weren't dismissing her. No, now they were watching, waiting for her to prove that she truly belonged. The Duke's hand was steady at her back, firm and unwavering, a constant reminder of the power he had claimed and the power he had shared with her. She could feel his presence like a force beside her, but it wasn't just his power that had changed things. It was hers too. She had been chosen, and now, she was no longer the woman they had pitted. She was the woman they had to reckon with. "You've made your choice," a voice from the crowd called out, breaking the silence. Eleanor's breath hitched as she turned to face the nobleman who spoke. It was Lord Everley, a man known for his sharp tongue and sharper gaze. He had been one of the loudest critics of the Duke's choice, and now, he stood in front of them, his eyes narrowed, filled with a challenge. The room held its breath. Victor, however, was unperturbed. He turned slowly to face the man, his gaze cool and unflinching. There was no hesitation in his movement, no uncertainty. "Yes," Victor said, his voice firm, "I have made my choice. And she stands beside me." The room seemed to inhale collectively, the tension rising once again. Eleanor could feel the power in his words, the way they reverberated through the space around them. She stood taller, her chest rising with each breath, as if his words were giving her strength, giving her the confidence she had never known. "This is your world now," Lord Everley said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "But it doesn't change the truth." The truth. Eleanor's stomach tightened, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. She knew what he was implying. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't worthy of standing beside the Duke. She wasn't of their world. The words stung, more than she had expected. But then, she felt it, a shift within her. Something inside her snapped, a realization that this was not just his battle. It was hers too. She had been given this place, this position, and no one, not Everley, not anyone, could take it from her. She took a step forward, her heart beating faster, her pulse quickening. The room seemed to hold its breath as she moved, but this time, she didn't falter. She didn't shrink away. She stepped into the space beside the Duke, her chin lifted, her back straight. "The truth," she said, her voice steady but full of strength. "The truth is that I am here. I am standing beside the Duke, and nothing will change that." Her words rang out in the silence, sharp and clear. The room was still, the nobles looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. She had claimed her place, not just beside the Duke, but in this world, and they had no choice but to accept it. The Duke's eyes softened as he glanced at her, a hint of pride flickering in them. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, the power in his silence more than words could ever convey. The tension in the room was palpable, but it was no longer the suffocating, oppressive force it had been. It had shifted, changed. The power had been redefined, and Eleanor, for the first time, truly understood it. She wasn't just the woman who had been chosen. She was the woman who had earned her place. And now, nothing could take that away from her. The room remained quiet, the air thick with the aftermath of the shift. The Duke took a step toward her, his hand brushing against hers in a subtle but powerful gesture. The contact was small, almost insignificant, but it was enough. It was a promise that they were in this together, that no matter what came next, they would face it as equals. The world around them seemed to breathe again, the tension easing ever so slightly. The nobles who had once looked at Eleanor with disdain now looked at her with something else. It was no longer fear. It was respect. And with that, the final piece fell into place. The power had shifted, and Eleanor was no longer the woman who had been overlooked. She was the woman who had been chosen, and she would never go back. The Duke's hand rested lightly on Eleanor's shoulder as they stood at the grand window, overlooking the sprawling grounds of the estate. The ballroom behind them had cleared, the echoes of whispers and judgment fading into the distance. The moment was heavy, but there was no denying the finality that had settled between them. The power had shifted completely, and Eleanor felt it in the air around her. She was no longer the woman she had been when she first stepped into this world, unseen, overlooked, dismissed. Now, she stood with the Duke. The choice he had made was not just about him or her, but about everything they would become together. The room was silent, the weight of everything they had endured pressing down on them. The guests had all gone, but the tension remained, though it was different now. There was no more judgment. There was no more fear. There was only the undeniable truth that she belonged here, by his side. Eleanor turned slowly to face him, the soft light of the moon casting a pale glow over his sharp features. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and for the first time, she saw the fullness of his expression, something deeper than just the power he exuded. It was a rare softness, one that only appeared when his eyes met hers. "You've done it," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady but filled with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. "We've done it," he replied, his voice quiet, but his presence as commanding as ever. She stepped closer to him, the space between them shrinking, though her heart was still racing. The battle, the conflict, the tension, they were all behind them now, but the power they had claimed together felt solid, unwavering. "You're no longer that girl," the Duke continued, his hand gently lifting her chin so she could meet his gaze. "You're not the one they thought you were. You're not invisible anymore. You're mine, and you stand beside me because you belong here." Eleanor felt a tremor run through her, not from fear, but from something much deeper. There was a quiet strength inside her now, a force she had never known existed before. She had been chosen by him, yes, but in that choice, she had claimed something for herself. She had claimed her place, and that was something no one could take away from her. She reached up, touching his hand where it rested on her face. The contact was simple, but the connection between them was undeniable. "We are both different now," she said, her voice soft, yet firm. The Duke's lips curved slightly into a smile, and there was something both fierce and comforting in the way he looked at her. "You're right. But this world, the one we have now, is ours, and we've earned it." The words hung in the air, final and full of meaning. Eleanor could feel the weight of them, the realization that everything had changed in this single moment. The Duke had claimed her, and she had claimed him. Together, they were untouchable. The world around them, the one that had once looked down on her, now seemed so far away. She could feel the power shift, the recognition that she was now part of this world. And it wasn't just because of the Duke's influence. It was because she had the strength to stand beside him, not behind him. The tension that had been building over the last few weeks finally seemed to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, unspoken understanding between them. They were a unit now, an unbreakable force, and no one could take that from them.